Jackson's lungs burned with the scrap metal taste of recycled air and copper. He stood at the center of the Arch of Lament, a narrow throat of white stone that served as the only path to the Queen's inner sanctum. Below him, the obsidian citadel screamed, not the elegant musical chime of Solari technology, but the screeching of serrated limbs against pressurized hulls. He adjusted the grip on the heavy pulse cannon, his knuckles white and slick with something dark that wasn't his own blood. The chitinid swarm poured through the breached corridors like a flood of obsidian glass. They were coming for the High Queen. They were coming for the heart of Athelgard. And the only thing standing in the way was the creature they used to keep in a gilded cage for entertainment. The softest creature held the hardest line. 6 months ago, Jackson Thorne had arrived on the floating citadel as a diplomatic insurance policy. To the Solari hegemony, he was a decorative hostage, a biological curiosity with a heart rate that was too fast and a lifespan that was too short. Queen Lyra had looked at him with those complex violet eyes and seen a pet. She spoke of human fragility as if it were a tragic poem. They called his people the children of the mud, a race that had barely mastered fire while the Solari were carving stars. He was kept in a garden of synthetic light, fed exotic fruits, and expected to look interesting during state dinners. Ironically, they never bothered to look at his records. They saw the softness of his skin and the lack of chitinous plating, but they missed the decade he spent in the orbital trenches of Europa. They saw a quiet man and mistook it for a broken one. Then the sky broke. The chitinids didn't announce themselves with a declaration. They arrived as a rain of organic spikes that pierced the citadel's upper domes. The Solari shields flickered and died in a burst of failing energy. In the sublevels, the panic was immediate and absolute. The Solari warriors, built for ritualistic duels and long-range energy volleys, crumbled when the swarm closed the distance. They were masters of the high ground, but they had no stomach for the mud. As the royal guard hustled Queen Lyra toward the ancient sublevels, Jackson saw a captain drop his heavy-duty pulse cannon to run faster. The Solari officer didn't even look back. He just wanted to be behind the blast doors. Jackson didn't run. He stopped, picked up the discarded weapon, and felt the familiar heavy hum of the power cell vibrating through his palms. It was too big for a human, but he braced it against his hip. He looked at the retreating golden capes of the guard, and then at the dark tide of claws surging up the main stairs. Truth is, the hegemony had spent centuries believing their own myths. They thought scale and age equaled survival. But humanity's greatest weapon isn't technology. It's the refusal to stay down. He stepped into the middle of the arch. It was a bridge built of bone and sheer human stubbornness. The first chitinid drone leaped, a blur of 6 legs and snapping mandibles. Jackson didn't blink. He pulled the trigger, and the recoil nearly dislocated his shoulder. But the drone turned into a spray of green ichor midair. They expected a pet but found a predator in the shadows. And as the next wave crested the stairs, Jackson Thorne planted his feet and started to laugh. The pulse cannon shrieked a high, whining protest of metal pushed past its limit. Jackson's vision was a blur of sweat and stinging salt, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. Every time a chitinid claw scraped the white stone of the arch, he fired. The vibration traveled through his arms, rattling his teeth, turning his bones into tuning forks for violence. He was no longer a man, he was a gate. A crude, stubborn obstruction in a world that prided itself on elegance. The Solari warriors watched from the shadows of the sub-level viewport, their faces pale behind crystalline visors. They saw a small, unarmored creature standing amidst a mountain of black carapaces. They saw the pet they had mocked for his soft skin and fragile frame, doing what their entire legion could not. He was a bridge built of bone and sheer human stubbornness. The cannon finally seized, the barrel glowing a dull, angry red. Jackson didn't panic. He dropped the dead weight and pulled a serrated combat knife from his boot, a piece of rugged steel that looked like a jagged tooth compared to the Solari's energy blades. A chitinid warrior, 3 times his size, lunged. It was a mass of clicking plates and barbed stingers. Jackson stepped into the strike, letting the creature's own momentum carry it onto his blade. He felt the sickening jar of the impact, the way the chitinid's weight nearly crushed his ribs. But he twisted the steel. He roared, a sound that wasn't a scream of pain, but a demand for space. Truth is, the chitinid's understood strength and they understood technology. But they didn't understand why a dying organism would keep fighting when the math said it was over. Then, the ceiling didn't just leak, it vanished. A pillar of white-hot fusion fire punched through the upper spires of the citadel. The atmospheric pressure shifted with a violent pop, and the screeching of the swarm was suddenly drowned out by the thunder of heavy lift dropships. These weren't the graceful bird-like vessels of the Solari. These were the Gaia Reach iron hulls, ugly, blocky, and bristling with railguns. The human reinforcement fleet had arrived. They didn't descend with music or ceremony. They came down with the sound of sledgehammers. Heavy infantry in thick, scarred power armor hit the floor of the arch, their boots cracking the polished stone. They didn't look at the queen. They looked at the man standing in the center of the carnage, his shirt shredded, his hands stained dark, still holding a knife, as if he intended to take on the entire swarm alone. Thorn. A voice crackled through a helmet comm. Status. Jackson took a shaky breath, his chest heaving. He looked back at Queen Lyra, who was staring at him as if she were seeing a ghost or a god. The hubris of scale had vanished from her eyes. She no longer saw a biological curiosity. She saw the reason her species was still breathing. The line held, Jackson rasped. The cleanup was brutal and efficient. Human fire teams swept the corridors, their tactics a jagged contrast to the Solari's rigid formations. They moved like a single organism, clearing the unbeatable swarm with a cold, practiced ferocity. In the weeks that followed, the obsidian citadel remained floating, but the atmosphere had changed. The gilded cages were gone. Queen Lyra sat at the high council table, but there was a new chair to her right. It wasn't made of crystal or light, but of simple, dark steel. Jackson Thorne sat there, not as a hostage, but as the chief strategic advisor to the hegemony. He didn't wear the silks of a pet anymore. He wore his old, oil-stained flight suit. When the Solari generals spoke of retreat or the impossibility of the next frontier, they would look at the man who had turned a narrow bridge into a graveyard. They had learned the lesson humanity had been trying to tell the galaxy for 1,000 years. Resilience isn't about how hard you hit, it's about the fact that you simply won't stay down. The era of human-alien parity didn't start with a treaty signed in ink. It started with a man, a knife, and a refusal to move. The galaxy was wide and terrifying, but for the first time in history, the Solari felt safe, not because of their shields, but because they finally had a predator of their own watching the door. Would you like me to write an epilogue detailing Jackson's first major diplomatic mission? Or perhaps a scene where he trains the first joint human-Solari strike team?